Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, May 14th, 2025, and our friends Ray McGovern and John Helmer are back with us. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nima.
Let's get started with what's going on in considering the case of Ukraine and the talks in Istanbul. Here is what Donald Trump said and how he sees Vladimir Putin and Zelensky to go to Istanbul.
If President Putin doesn't show up in Turkey for the talks with Ukraine, what will you do?
Well, I don't know if he's showing up. I know he would like me to be there, and that's a possibility. If we could end the war, I'd be thinking about that. Now, tomorrow, we're all booked out. You understand that? We're all set.
But you go if he
We're going
goes?
to go UAE tomorrow, and so we have a very full situation. Now, that doesn't mean I wouldn't do it to save a lot of lives and come back. But, yeah, I think they're thinking about something. I don't know that he would be there if I'm not there. We're going to find out. Marco's going, and Marco's been very effective.
Ray, go ahead. Your take.
It's really a farce, Nima, watching not only Trump, but also the European leaders. First, they're threatening, big sanctions, or else, or unless you obey what we want. And then all of a sudden, Trump says, no, that's wrong. We're going to really support these negotiations. I hope they succeed. I hope that Putin and Zelensky will be there. He had no reason to hope that Putin would be there. And Zelensky is playing the comedian that he has always been. And now the latest word that Lavrov, foreign minister of Russia, has decided, he's not gonna go. Who's going to talk to Rubio, his opposite number? So the whole thing is illustrative of a very important fact, and that is President Trump is winging it all by himself with the help of this real estate developer, Stephen Witkoff. Rubio, Trump says Rubio has been very effective. Well, unless he gets the word from Trump, he's been very ineffective, for God's sake. So never, and I've been around a while, right? Never have I seen such overt discord, so many overt disconnects between key U.S. policymakers. I don't hold much hope for the talks tomorrow if they eventuate, especially if Rubio is met with a lesser official, according to the pecking order. But I think what the whole episode shows that Trump is hell-bent and determined to force this thing on Zelensky. And if Zelensky plays games, I think there's a good chance now that Trump, as G.D. Vance and others have said, will say, oh, this guy's impossible. You Europeans, you take care of him. We're out of here. I think that's more likely now if tomorrow's meeting ends as a charade or never even happens.
John, go ahead.
I think it's not quite the farce that Ray described it, but it does show that each side can't accept the other side's formula. The formula from which we began, and bear in mind from the last time we indicated that the Russian side believes it's submitted to Trump its term paper. So Trump ought to know, but maybe can't remember, the terms on the Russian term paper. He also ought to know, but doesn't seem to grasp, what Kellogg is saying that's on the European and Ukrainian term paper that Kellogg has accepted for the president. The formula, an argument here is Russia says negotiations first, ceasefire after. And the negotiations then have to focus on several key terms on the battlefield. We can come back to those. The position in the administration, the Europeans and Zelensky position is the formula negotiations ceasefire first, negotiations after. Now, what's wrong with that formula from the Russian point of view? Putin has said, Maria Zakharova has said as spokesman for the foreign ministry, and Russian officials like Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, and others have been repeating for some time now, and all in the last 48 hours. This is Russia will not accept a ceasefire if its only purpose is to allow the US and the Europeans, through Germany, through Poland, to rearm the Ukraine so it can go back to the fight, better supplied with air defense, better supplied with offensive weapons, better supplied with ammunition. So a ceasefire is not acceptable from a Russian point of view. I described that last time. The Russian point of view is cease force, not ceasefire. And what you heard with Trump en route to Qatar about 5 hours ago is that it's going backwards and forwards, or as we said in a previous last week, this is going down to the wire. Remember what the Russian side have decided. The Russian side, including President Putin, have decided to make a deal, to give a deal to Trump and to meet him in Abu Dhabi, where he'll be next after he leaves Qatar. The other side, including Kellogg, maybe Hegseth, maybe Vance, and certainly Zelensky and the Europeans, led by Macron and Starmer, said, no, we will go to Istanbul, and we expect to have a troika, a three-way summit, as the negotiations progress or just after, and that would be Trump, Zelensky, and Putin. Now, the last time Putin met, and the only time he's met Zelensky, was in Paris in 2019. And Zakharova, the foreign ministry spokesman, pointed that out when asked about the last meeting. There was a summit meeting. Putin had agreed with the others. Zelensky had agreed going into the meeting, and at the meeting and coming out, he changed the terms. So there's no possibility that the Russian side will accept another about-face like Zelensky's capable of pulling, and they expect him to do so. And Kellogg has laid out what Zelensky will put on the table. European forces in the west of the Ukraine, another force close to the Dnieper River. All these issues are absolutely unacceptable to the Russian side. This is why the Russian side says we negotiate first and then we cease fire. The concessions at the ceasefire level depend on the acceptability of the negotiations. So here we go, down to the wire for Istanbul. And when Sergei Lavrov said a couple of hours ago, as reported in Moscow, he's not going, that's very close to putting the Russian kibosh on it. Rubio can be matched because he's both the Secretary of State now and he's Michael Waltz's replacement as National Security Advisor. So it's possible that instead of Lavrov, Yuri Ushakov, the presidential assistant in the Kremlin for foreign affairs, would match Rubio at that rank. But Russians always match. So if Lavrov says he's not going, then the team that met Rubio, Waltz, and Vitkov in Riyadh, was it Riyadh? Yes, it was Riyadh in February. That team is no longer going. So what we know the American side will be Rubio, Vitkov, and Kellogg. That's clear. The Russian match would be Lavrov, Ushakov, and Kirill Dmitriev to match Vitkov. They're not going to bother matching Kellogg. But if Lavrov announces he's not going, that's an immediate downgrade. And it indicates there's no agreement on the difference between the formula of each side. If there's no agreement and the negotiations are downgraded, there's only one possibility now for a summit meeting to take place, and Trump knows it and isn't sure. That's what he meant when he went from one side to the other in the aircraft that you reported. It's possible that Putin would go to Abu Dhabi and meet Trump there without Zelensky. That remains a possibility. But in Istanbul, the negotiating level's gone down because there's no agreement in advance on how to compromise between, or to how to adjust one side's formula with the other.
Let me just interject here in a wider perspective that the British have this expression, put someone on the back foot. It seems to me this whole initiative, starting with the 2:00 a.m. announcement on Sunday by Putin, that, hey, let's go to Istanbul, let's talk. We're always ready to talk. That was all designed, perhaps in coordination with someone like Witkoff, to put Zelensky in an impossible position, and his European supporters as well. The coalition of the deadheads, one might call them, not the coalition of the willing. And I think that's going to work. In other words, whatever comes out of Istanbul, whoever goes, whoever doesn't go, Zelensky is going to screw up royally once again. The other thing I want to say is simply that it's really important, and I'm not saying this has been done, but there is some confusion about a ceasefire and negotiations. What Putin said, to everyone's amazement, is, look, Thursday, that's tomorrow now, Thursday, I'm proposing direct negotiations, talks with Ukraine in Istanbul in order, get this now, in order to continue what had been interrupted when Ukraine withdrew from them in April 2022. That's the symbolic significance of Istanbul. They had an agreement. They had an agreement in April 2022, 6 weeks after the special military operation. And what happened? Boris Johnson, the clown from London, came in and said, no, we're going to support you, Zelensky, for as long as it takes. Well, it's now as long as it takes, and not going to support, that is, the US is not going to support Zelensky. Will the Europeans come to their senses? They're going to have to. They don't have the wherewithal to support Zelensky. So there's a great difference, as John, I'm sure, would agree, between ceasefire talks and negotiations. And what Putin is saying, yeah, I quote him, let me reiterate, Russia is ready for talks without any preliminary conditions. There are combat actions and a war going on now, and we propose to resume negotiations that were not interrupted by us, but by others in Istanbul 3 years ago, okay? Well, what's wrong with that? Putin asks. So all these sleepy reporters. So thanks for coming here at 2:00 in the morning. I thought as long as you're still here, you might listen to some sensible things. The die is cast. Let's see how our Ukrainian friends or Ukrainian counterparts react. There's no good option for Zelensky. I think he'll smear himself quite adroitly. And I dare say the coalition of the tone deaf, or the crackheads, or whatever you want to call those guys, Stromer, Merz, Macron, and Zelensky, they're going to be put well on their back feet, in my view.
I think that Ray's left out 2 points about the difference between Istanbul 1 and Istanbul 2. Istanbul 2, which is tomorrow, Thursday, requires, from the Russian point of view, and Ray's just read out what President Putin said, requires a cessation of US and NATO arms deliveries to the Ukraine. And second, it requires new elections in the Ukraine, which means the replacement of Zelensky. The first implements the demilitarization of the Ukraine, which was objective one of the special military operation. The second, elections replacing Zelensky, is the nearest the Russian side will come to implementing the denazification objective, objective number two. Those two conditions must apply. They did not and were not agreed in the initial documents of Istanbul 1. And it wasn't just Johnson or Biden or anyone else who told the Zelensky to can that agreement. When Vladimir Medinsky who was the head of the Russian delegation, the relatively low level, but presidential level, a leader of the Russian delegation in Istanbul 1, came back. He faced significant criticism from the general staff and the intelligence services and from his boss, Sergei Lavrov, for agreeing to terms which didn't guarantee they could be implemented and didn't include demilitarization or elections. Now, the reason the Russian side doesn't refer to Zelensky as President Zelensky, they use his name, but not his title, is Russia does not accept that he rules legitimately any longer. He rules by martial law. He's postponed elections. So denazification translates from Istanbul 1 now to elections. And it's not possible, think about it, that Zelensky is sitting at the table discussing elections in which he's to be replaced. No. So Istanbul 1 and Istanbul 2 are profoundly different, obviously, because both sides retreated from the terms, both sides. And second, President Putin has accepted he cannot make any further mistakes in concession to the other side. And he's trying to take the opportunity of Trump's independence from the Europeans. But let's come back to that in a minute. Offer a summit meeting. Sorry, Ray. To offer a summit meeting, but there can't be a summit without agreement on the terms. The formula isn't agreed, and the two other elements are not agreed. Trump has to agree to stop delivering arms to the Ukraine. There can't be any resupply on the Ukrainian side during a ceasefire, but that has to be a precondition for ceasefire, not a precondition for talks, but a condition.
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying, John. Putin didn't say any of those things at 2 o'clock in the morning. What he said was, let me reiterate, Russia is ready for talks without preliminary conditions. I'm talking about talks, okay, not a settlement. You're talking beyond that. Now, there's one point that I disagree with you on. David Arachamia was the principal Ukrainian negotiation, both in Belarus and in Istanbul, that came to that agreement. Okay, when he came back just a year and a half ago, he told the Ukrainian newspapers, "Look, we had this whole thing set up, and then Johnson came in and just said, no, we won't agree with this," and Zelensky went with Johnson. So we have the Ukrainian negotiators saying this was a done deal. We were all set. We were really happy. And what happened with the Russians? As a token of goodwill, they withdrew a lot of their forces from around Kiev. And what happened?
That's not true.
Let me just finish here. Those forces were not aimed at anything other than scaring the hell out of Zelensky. They succeeded. And that was seen with David Arachmania, who not only is Putin's best friend, but he's head of Putin's political faction in the Rada.
You mean Zelensky?
Zelensky.
I'm sorry. Okay. So what I'm saying here, John, is that the big thing here was that Putin undercut what these Europeans and Zelensky had decided to do You obey what we say, or else. What was or else? Well, it didn't take Putin but hours to come back and say, well, since you're all here, this is what we're going to do. We've always said we're ready for negotiations without preconditions. Now, so that's why I think it's really, really important to distinguish between negotiations toward those objectives that you mentioned, where they're going to come in real hard, okay? But they're going to they were going to start, or they will start tomorrow. And I see this as a joint Russia, U.S., Witkoff in particular, attempt to put Zelensky to bed here. He's going to make a fool of himself for sure. And then the question will be, okay, what do we do with this guy? Then we cut him off from arms aid. There's nothing in the pipeline except what's for the next couple of months. Cut him off from the financial supply that he needs to pay his people. And we'll say, now, you Europeans, you're really smart. You think you can do this? It's up to you. You build up your military-industrial complex over the next decade, and then maybe you'll match the Russians and help the Ukrainians. Give me a break. That's the way I think it's going to eventuate. We'll see tomorrow with who's right and who's wrong.
John,
we don't disagree on the immediate picture. On the other hand, we do disagree on why Istanbul was scrapped. There was a Russian disagreement with the terms that Medinsky had accepted. And
you mean the original in April of the 22?
And no one in Russia, and certainly I won't accept any Ukrainian official's account of why something was agreed with the Russians. Nothing the Ukrainians. Close to Zelensky. No, hang on. You put
how about a former Israeli prime minister?
Oh, rubbish.
Who said the same exact thing that David Arachmani, the negotiator, said. I don't know what your sources are, John, but it looked to me like it was it was a done deal.
No, that's not true. Ex-Israeli prime ministers running between the two, and Ukrainian officials don't represent anything like the consensus in Moscow. They might think they've heard from President Putin or somebody between President Putin and themselves, like Roman Abramovich did. It is not true. It's absolutely not true that Naftali Bennett was anything more than one of several emissaries, and it was not acceptable to the general staff, not acceptable to the Russian foreign ministry, and not acceptable to the intelligence services. So you can ask yourself who in the Kremlin wanted him, but Israelis and Ukrainians don't speak for the consensus of officials in Moscow, not then, and they don't now. So let's not argue about that. What we agree on now is what will happen on Thursday. And the reason it will not happen is that Putin offered Trump a summit meeting and a deal. And I don't think we agree. I think Trump is far more coordinating with the Europeans than you think. I think Trump plays the Europeans, Macron and Starmer in particular, as the bad cop, the maximalist position on the other side, while he plays the good cop. That's Witkoff.
Okay, just to clean up the Istanbul 2022 thing. In my view, we have the chief Ukrainian negotiator, best friend with Zelensky, who we know was in constant daily touch with him and had a power to maybe stop the Russians from going further, which was the whole Russian objective, okay? And we have the Russian negotiators in constant touch directly with Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. We know that as well. So this thing was blessed by both sides, and it's really bizarre to think that, and that's where they're going to pick up in Istanbul, and that's why it's relevant now, because there was what the Russians call a betrayal, and that's what Arachmani calls it, and that's what Naftali Bennett calls it, and lots of other people call it. I don't know who your sources in the General Staff are.
Well, they're a
But
lot better
Putin
Excuse me.
blessed the initialing of this thing, and they
Well-
were in fact betrayed. And the way the British and the Americans decided to disguise this betrayal was this massacre in Bucha, which was orchestrated by MI6 and the Ukrainian intelligence services to show how terrible Putin was. How could you possibly initial a deal with him? And that's the way that went down. The propaganda was very effective, at least here in the United States.
Yes, it's true that the Butcher massacre was a fabrication. And yes, it's true that it was used for propaganda purposes, just like the MH17 shootdown was used to start the process of remilitarizing the Ukraine in the middle of 2014. But we do not agree, and this is very important for audience to understand, because the evidence is, you don't have to ask me for my general sources. You're saying an Israeli can be believed and a Ukrainian can be believed about the process by which Roman Abramovich convinced Vladimir Putin, Roman Abramovich, a businessman who doesn't ever live in Russia anymore, he was in the room during the negotiations. And it's very clear, and we don't have to beat the horse about it, that those negotiations were led by a low-level foreign ministry official, but directed by Abramovich, who was on the phone to Putin. And the mistakes that were made were corrected when the delegation came back. But Abramovich didn't come back. He doesn't come back. He's out of this one. This is a consensual Russian position in which the mistakes the Russian side made in Istanbul back in 2022 have been corrected. And the point now is that Trump was offered by Putin the opportunity for a summit, but that could only happen if the terms were agreed sufficiently at the negotiations in Istanbul. You're right, we agree. The Zelensky Europeans sabotaged that, or tried to ambush Putin by saying, if there's to be a summit with Trump, there has to be one with Zelensky. Zelensky won't negotiate his replacement, won't negotiate a cessation of supply. He can't, he won't, he's dead if he does. Dead twice, politically and militarily. So if you take the view that's mine, that that Trump is coordinating with Macron, as Macron pointed out when they were in Kiev last Saturday, you've got a good cop, bad cop routine on the US part. In Witkoff represents the good cop, Kellogg the bad cop, and Trump is trying to make a deal between irreconcilable terms. And that's the point at which we came, and Lavrov pulls out. If Lavrov pulls out, we go downwards. The capacity of the Russian side then to agree terms has dropped. If that's happened, the only possibility that Trump would get his summit meeting with Putin is if Putin agrees to go to Abu Dhabi.
Yeah. Actually, we wanted to focus today on the Middle East, but we just yeah, because it's complicated, and let's see what would happen tomorrow, and that could bring some sort of insight. But when it comes to Donald Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia and right now in Qatar, and he's talking with the officials and many talks in terms of the regional changes, the regional policy of the United States. Ray, what were the main objectives on the part of the Trump administration in this visit?
Well, you have the Abraham Accord, so to speak. You have the U.S. still trying in a last gasp way to get the Saudis to make nice with the Israelis. The Saudis are not having much of that given what's happening in Gaza. One of the main things, of course, is money. I remember that ridiculous Oval Office session where MBS was there, and Trump was showing charts of all the military weaponry that the U.S. had sold, how much they got for it, all like this. So you can't exclude just just the fact of money here and selling and manufacturing and giving Saudi arms. I think there's some chance that Trump wanted to get a firsthand reading of how MBS, the Crown Prince, feels about what's going on in Gaza in particular. And it's very interesting, of course, that Trump has sort of decided to fly over. It's sort of like flying over Omaha, fly over Tel Aviv, and go right to Saudi Arabia. So things are percolating. There are lots of signs that Netanyahu has lost a lot of U.S. support. And whether Trump is willing to go against Netanyahu in a big way with respect to Gaza, well, that remains to be seen. I'm from Missouri, as we say in the States. That's the show me state. I would need to be shown that. However, I have to admit that there are lots of signs, not only that Trump is ticked off in a big way with Netanyahu, but he might translate that anger into actual deeds. I do hope fervently that he uses some kind of influence to stop the genocide in Gaza.
John, go ahead.
Well, I disagree again with Ray. Trump showed no interest in stopping the genocide in Gaza. And that's got a very interesting historical parallel with the meeting 80 years ago. And Trump introduced that in his speech in Riyadh. 80 years ago, February 1945, the present king, King Salman's father, Abdulaziz, met President Franklin Roosevelt in the Great Bitter Lake, the entrance to the Suez Canal. And I've talked about that in detail in the Jackal's Wedding. At that meeting, Roosevelt, having been briefed by several of his Jewish advisors in Washington, came and asked Abdulaziz to agree to the genocide of the Palestinian people. Only the word wasn't used then. Genocide didn't come to be acceptable in public discourse until about 1948. What Roosevelt said to Abdulaziz was, will you take the Palestinians if I pay you to? Meaning, will you take the Arabs of Palestine? And we'll move them out of Palestine so the Jews will move in. That was the deal. Colonel Bill Eddy translated it. Eddy was against putting that proposition to Abdulaziz. And we can come back to what Eddy said, because it is absolutely clearly mirrored now. Abdulaziz was clear: no genocide, no displacement. In fact, he said something famously interesting. He said, since when in Western or our practice do the losers, those who were defeated in war, meaning Germany, not punished by having to accept back the victims they had tried to destroy, the Jews? Why should we, the Arabs, innocent of the war you just fought, or on your side in the war you've just fought, pay with our land and resources for the Jewish victimization caused by Germany? That Germany should pay, German land should be provided, but not us. Now take a look at what Roosevelt did to soften the deal was he gave Abdulaziz, who was crippled to not the same extent as FDR, his wheelchair, a second wheelchair, Roosevelt's wheelchair. And second, he offered Abdulaziz a Dakota aircraft. For the first time, Saudi Arabia would have an aircraft. The problem was, and Abdulaziz was not fooled, the aircraft was to have been piloted by OSS men. The whole airplane was a spy vehicle to spy for the US, OSS being the predecessor of the CIA, on the Saudis. Why? Because the US had two strategic objectives for the Saudis in addition to resettling the Palestine Arabs. One, they wanted Dahran, the airbase, as a platform for launching nuclear weapons by bombers against the Soviet Union. 2, they wanted to push the British out of the concessions of Saudi oil. And that's where Bill Eddy, the translator in that conference, was representing the American oil interests. Now look where we are. At that time, and you can see them, the Saudi delegation coming on board the Quincy. The Saudis were carrying their begging bowls. Now look at the situation. It's Trump who's carrying the begging bowl to Saudi Arabia and announcing, I've received a $600 billion investment from the Saudis and $1 trillion altogether from the Arabs. He's begging for the money. And who should take the plane now? Trump takes the plane from the Qataris. It's a complete reversal. Now, if you look at it from a Saudi and an Arab point of view, several things become clear. And MBS is no fool at understanding this. Trump didn't understand this. The Saudis think the US is carrying the begging bowl. They think they can buy the Americans this time round, as the Americans thought they could buy Abdulaziz the first time round. That's changed. The begging bowl has been reversed, and that's important to understand. Second, when Trump talked about, sorry, I'll just finish. Ray, I hope it's not anything I've said. Okay. Trump did not in any way disclaim the intention to back Israel to destroy Gaza. His Abraham Accords are designed to implement the liquidation of Arab Palestine. And it's not possible for the Saudis to accept that publicly. So what's happened, what was different, is that on the one hand, the US-Israeli plan to destroy the Arab national ideology has succeeded, more or less succeeded. The Arabs have been badly destroyed. Only the Yemenis fight on as the Arabs. Iran, different. Iran is still in resistance. Second, the triumph of the Israeli-US ideology over Arab ideology has been paralleled by the triumph of Arab money. And the Saudis think they can buy US support. Well, they can't. They can't, but they're trying. So there's a complete reversal of confidence, and there is no Saudi acceptance of the genocide. And Trump said nothing at all to disclaim the genocide. In fact, by saying Abraham Accords, he meant Palestine without Arabs.
Ray, here is what Donald Trump said about.
Let me apologize first that my
Go
wife
ahead.
needed some instant attention, so that's taken care of now.
I know
It wasn't that I was walking out on your son.
I knew you weren't, Ray, and I'm very sorry you had to handle that one. But come back, have a go at me.
No, I was only 6 years old at the time, when Franklin Roosevelt tried those games with the Saudi king. I don't remember much of it, and you know a lot more about that area than I do. So what I heard, and I heard most of what you said, John, I pretty much agree with. The only thing is now things have changed so much, and when I expressed a wish that Trump would see that genocide is not what Americans do or support or enable, it was a wish. It was not an expectation. And, I just had a comment here. If you read Doris Kearns Goodman's book, what's the name of it? It's about Franklin and Mrs. Roosevelt. You could see that Franklin Roosevelt himself was influenced by anti-Semitism. You know, as well as I do, that ships with full of cargo of Jewish people trying to get into the United States were prohibited from getting into the United States during the war and before the war because Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as progressive as he was, didn't think it a particularly good political move to let a bunch of Jews in the country, okay? And Eleanor, to her great credit, I love Eleanor. What'd she do? There was a great big ship right off the coast of Virginia. She had visas fabricated and gave each one of those Jews a visa, said, get into the hinterland of Virginia, disappear, you're free. And that happened. Okay, so all I'm saying is that even people like Roosevelt were not immune to the anti-Semitism of that day, and that played its role in giving incredible favor to the Jews and letting them have a homeland for a people, for a place with no people. Give me a break. Nobody told me when I was 8 years old and we were celebrating the creation of Israel. Nobody told me that there were people already there and that 750,000 Palestinians were driven out of that place, most of them into Gaza. So this is a little background. I relate to what you said, John, but I have this personal reminiscence, and also reading people like Doris Kearns Goodwin about how even Roosevelt was subservient to anti-Semitism in those days, and now we've come full circle, and I stress full circle.
John, here is what Donald Trump said about Iran. He said that if they don't reach an agreement, we won't let them to sell any oil. Is he backing down on his position that we're going to get a deal or we're going to go to war with Iran?
Well, once again, in this particular case, he's playing good cop, bad cop with himself. On the one hand, he has said, I thought, in a significant concessional tone in his last press conference. And the last press conference he had in Washington before he left, the morning of the day he got on the plane to Saudi Arabia. Let me read you what he said. It was a press conference with Robert Kennedy Jr. It was mainly about health, but he took quite a lot of questions at the end. About Iran, he had this to say, and he's kind of repeated it in Saudi Arabia, but he's been unable to get the Saudis to take a hostile line to Iran. It's basically been a bit buried. This is Trump talking about Iran and the negotiations. I think you have very good things happening there too, by the way. Can't have a nuclear weapon, but I think that they are talking intelligently. We're in the midst of talking to them, and they're right now acting very intelligent. We want Iran to be healthy, wealthy, and wonderful, and happy and great, but they can't have a nuclear weapon. Now, that's the first time I've heard a president of the United States say that the Iranians are negotiating intelligently, which means in good faith, which means that Witkoff has come back and convinced Trump that there's a basis for a negotiation and an agreement. But it looks like a reversal to JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan, because it will mean no nuclear weapon, which means no enrichment and no weaponization program. But he's dropping the maximum positions. There has to be no enrichment at all. And two, that there can't be any missile program. In other words, total demilitarization of Iran. That's not negotiable. So it would seem to me that, as unclear as Trump usually is, the tone there to say that the Iranians are talking intelligently means two things. First, he accepts that they've got a position. Second, he accepts that they're still talking. He's far from saying we're going to have a deal on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or the weekend. So he's prepared to continue. And third, it implies he's rejected the combination of Israeli pressure from the Congress and the Israeli lobby to go to military means. So he's downplaying that. And I think we talked about that last time. It's very positive that Trump appears to have accepted the notion that were the US and Israel to launch an attack on Iran, they risk very serious losses and damage to the US bases, to any US aircraft that might be operating, to Israeli aircraft, and that the Iranian retaliation might not only be at the US bases, but at significant targets in Israel, which the Houthis, the Yemenis, have proved they can reach, just as Iran has already reached. So I'm, to use Ray's word, optimistic and hopeful that the Iranian negotiation is coming to a better and clearer outcome without war against Iran.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there is that the Israel lobby is even stronger than the pro-war Ukrainian lobby. There are lots of slips between cup and lip here once Trump gets home. The wild card here, of course, is Netanyahu. If you look at his political situation, he is in real dire straits. He doesn't want to go to jail, even though they have a nice bridal suite for him and his wife. That is motivating a lot of his actions. Would he try to mousetrap the U.S. into a war against Iran? Well, I hope that the U.S. military has told their counterparts in Tel Aviv and West Jerusalem that, look, that would be the end of Israel. And that would be the end of a lot of our military bases in the area. So don't even think about it. Don't even think about it. Now, let me add a little thing here, because a lot depends on whether support for Israel in our country is the same as it was traditionally. Now, I'll speak from 24 years of tradition, okay? John will remember this very, very distinctly. Here's Netanyahu in a very, very adulatory atmosphere in the living room of big supporters. The year is 2001. I think I have this year. What I did was I looked at the video. What Netanyahu says is, turn that video off. The fellow forgot. And so here's Netanyahu at his raw truth, if truth is the right word. The Arabs are preparing a campaign of terror. They think that will break us. We got to hit them hard. The price is not bearable. We got to do it now. A total assault on the Palestinians to bring them to a state of panic that everything is collapsing. The woman interrupts, the woman of the house. But wait a minute. At that point, the whole world will be against us. They will say that we are occupiers. The world won't say anything, says Netanyahu. The world will say we are defending ourselves and that we have the right to defend ourselves. Woman, so you're not afraid of the world? Netanyahu, now get this. No, especially not with America. I know America. America is a thing that can be easily moved in the right direction. The Americans will not bother us. Let's suppose that they will say something like, oh, so they say it. So what? 80%. Get this, folks. 2001, Netanyahu speaking freely. Quote, 80% of the Americans support us. It's absurd. Period. End quote. Okay, why do I adduce that? Not only because it's so telling, but is that still the case? I don't think so. And does that translate into power for people who want some justice for the Middle East in our country? I think it probably does. Is that new? It is new. And if genocide doesn't bring condemnation of Israel, what the hell kind of America do we live in? So I see hope, as John sees hope here, that there might be some pressure on Trump to bring whatever influence he has to bear to make this situation better in Gaza I can't get away from Gaza because it just strikes me as abhorrent that women and children and others are dying in the numbers that they are dying, and I can't participate in any round table or any interview without making that point.
John, let me play a clip for you and Ray, and here is Benjamin Netanyahu arguing that a war in the Middle East since 1982. Let me play this clip that shows how Netanyahu is trying to manipulate. We know that Donald Trump is not happy with that, at least. And he somehow feels that Netanyahu behind the scene is doing something to his administration. Here is what Netanyahu has been telling us for such a long time.
The Soviet Union and its chief proxy, the PLO, international terrorism would collapse.
If you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee that it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region. Obviously, we like to see a regime change, at least I would, in Iran, just as I would like to see in Iraq. The question now is a practical question. What is the best place to proceed? It's not a question of whether Iraq's regime should be taken out, but when should it be taken out? More victories you amass, the easier the next victory becomes. The first victory in Afghanistan makes the second victory in Iraq that much easier. The second victory in Iraq will make the third victory that much easier too, but it may change the nature of achieving that victory. In the Middle East, Iran's axis of terror confronts America, Israel, and our Arab friends. This is not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash between barbarism and civilization.
Yeah. Here is, John, what's your take on the way that Donald Trump is trying to deal with Netanyahu? Do you find it somehow he's trying to do something different from other presidents, or he's not able to go against Netanyahu? He's not that much powerful, let's put it that way.
Well, first of all, let me say that, and it's not because I agree with or I'm happy about it, what Netanyahu said in that clip has come true. I mean, I was, just to say parenthetically, an advisor to the Secretary General of the Arab League in the early 1990s. And one of my jobs, or one of the reasons for my role, was to advise the Secretary General, who was then Tunisian, because Egypt had betrayed the Arab cause in the Camp David Accords, and Arab League had moved to Tunis, financed by Saudi Arabia at the time. My role was to monitor and analyze Arab policy in Washington, as well as Israeli policy in Washington. That was the role, and it was a short one. Why was it short is irrelevant. Why I went on to work with Greece. The basic result now is there is no Arab national ideology and no national Arab regime fighting for the independence of the Arab states against the combination of Israel and the United States. Libya, Muammar Gaddafi was assassinated finally after years of US policy to kill him. Kill him personally, that's what they have been trying to do since Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski came up with the proposal to do so in the 1979 period. Second, Syria is finished. We just saw Syria broken up into three pieces: Turkish, Israeli, and American. Nothing Syrian. What we saw was President Trump celebrating the individual responsible for representing the breakup of Syria. Egypt is totally neutralized and dependent on the United States. What other regime shall we talk about? Iraq. You heard Netanyahu talk about removing Saddam. That's been done too. What's Iraq, if not also broken up and divided between Kurds in the north, Shia associated with Iran, and Sunnis reduced to minor power in Iraq and so-called terrorist formations. We could go on with the list. What the Israeli-American plan has always been has basically come true. It just hasn't come true, hasn't been implemented at the speed the Israelis would like. That leaves Iran as the focal point of resistance to the expansion. And when Netanyahu says he's for regime change, there's no indication whatsoever in my mind that there's any difference between Vance, Trump, Rubio, or the officials below them on that point. They would like regime change in Iran also, but they can't achieve it at a serious risk of loss because Iran has shown the capability of mobilizing. It has deterrent capability at the missile level, the warhead level, and at the level of surviving economic sanctions. They've shown the capability to resist, which none of those Arab states or leaders have been able to show, neither the Palestinians, the PLO, Hamas has been reduced, Hezbollah has been reduced, and the others have been broken up and divided, and their leaders murdered or driven away. So Iran's the last foundation of the resistance to a US-Israeli plan since 48, 49, a plan that Franklin Roosevelt tried to get Abdulaziz to accept in 45. And I have to say, Eleanor Roosevelt was more in favor at that time of displacing the Arabs from Palestine than her husband was at that time on that point. So what's the point? The point is that Israel serves a strategic US interest and has done from before it began. The strategic interest in the war period and then in the post-war period is to combat and break up the Soviet Union. And the Arab states were the platforms for bomber delivery of nuclear weapons, as we already said. I don't see current disagreements on timing, strategy, tactics between Netanyahu's regime in Israel and the United States in the form of President Trump and others. I don't see current disagreements as a significant change in US policy. No, sir, not at all. But the deterrent capability Iran is showing and the Yemenis are showing they can take any amount of punishment that the Israelis and the United States can throw at them, including the Arab complicity in the attacks on Yemen. Saudi airspace is used. Emirate bases are used. Resupply points are used. There's Arab complicity, as there always has been, on one side, on the anti-Arab side, regrettably. But now the Arab sheikdoms have the power of money, which they didn't have back in 45. The power of oil is less than the power of money now. And the power of Russia is less than Stalin represented back in 49, or the Soviet Union represented when it prevented an Allied intervention to stop the Libyan revolution of Muammar Gaddafi. All of those things are different now, but I don't think it's advisable to assure the audience that there is a real break between Israel and the United States. No, sirree.
Well, let me just comment on that. I think that when you look at the polls, the support for Israel among common Americans has fallen well below 80%, and I'll just leave it at that. This is going to have political implications over the longer run, not over the shorter run. What I'd like to do is go back to 1991 when we had that terrific victory over that disheveled group of Iraqis that went into Kuwait. Okay, boy, did we beat them. Okay, now in early 1991, General Wesley Clark, who had been head of NATO, okay, he went to Paul Wolfowitz of the famous Wolfowitz doctrine, and he said, Paul, what's the best lesson that we learned from this wonderful victory that you kind of oversaw? And Wolfowitz said, the most important lesson is that we could do these things and the Soviets and the Russians won't stop us. Now, Wolfowitz was a bright guy, okay? Now, bear in mind, General Clark, that there will come a time when the Russians will be able to stop us, and we have to make sure that we build up our military potential so that there's no peer at all for that time, because it will come eventually. Now, I don't know what happened to Wolfowitz. Well, I do know what happened to Iraq. And when I was asked to explain at a congressional hearing why we attacked Iraq when there were no weapons of mass destruction there, I did a little acronym. It was OIL. Jon Stewart criticized me heavily for violating the rules of acronyms because the O meant oil, right? O for oil, I for Israel. And as I watched those Congress people go like this as soon as I mentioned the word Israel, my God, it's a holy Moses. Here I am on CNN, C-SPAN. I'm an intelligence officer. I don't need any money. I don't need any advice. I'm going to tell it like it is. Yeah, Israel, I said. And the L in OIL was logistics for the permanent military bases we coveted in Iraq, later termed not permanent, but enduring. Yeah, enduring military bases, because enduring sounded a little more subtle. Okay, so that's 1991, and now we're up to 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. And John has explained the. Now, what were they saying, these neocons? Proceeding from this paper that they wrote for Netanyahu in the late 90s, okay? Wolfowitz himself, all these Pentagon people, what were they saying? They were saying, well, we'll do Iraq, and then real men go to Tehran. So there we are, the real men go to Tehran, and they're going to do that, okay? Now, the only problem was that after Iraq, something big happened. The U.S. helped foment an insurrection in Syria. And the president himself said, Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, has to go. He's got to go, okay? Everybody says he's got to go, okay? And they did everything they possibly could to get him to go, okay? At the UN, 2015, September, President Putin went to President Obama and said, look, what Wolfowitz says, that's passé, okay? He said, the Russians won't stop us. We're going to stop you. Just want to let you know that we're sending our fighter bombers and other military equipment to help Bashar al-Assad defend himself against all those, what do they call them? Non-violent terrorists, or moderate. That was the word. Moderate terrorists that you're supporting. That's for the birds. We're sending our troops in. So what happened? I'm sorry about this. I should have. So what happens? They do send their troops in, and Putin says, "Look, it's a new world, Mr. Obama. I would suggest you get John Kerry to get together with Sergei Lavrov and talk this thing through. We need a ceasefire. We don't need to shoot each other over Syria. God, this is awful." 11 months they negotiated, Lavrov and Kerry. At least they were talking to each other in those days, right? And what eventuates? A ceasefire. And how long did that last? 9 days. Was it approved by Putin? Was it approved by Obama? Yes, personally approved by them. But the U.S. Air Force thought differently, and they bombed fixed Syrian positions 9 days later and killed about 100 Syrian soldiers. So what am I saying here? I'm saying that our military was out of control then, but the whole business was the Russians couldn't stop us. Now, let's just go forward here to today. Is Russia prepared to stop us in Iran? Well, we know that Russia and China have very, very close agreements with Iran, that they support Iran not only with these agreements, but with hardware anti-aircraft missilery that you won't believe. Okay, so the situation has changed. What has not changed is this notion of American invincibility or exceptionalism, or what's the other word?
Indispensable.
Right, indispensability. You got it. Thanks. So now, if Trump is reined in here by people like Tulsi Gabbard, who knows which end is up, and whose influence can be seen, I believe, in some of the recent more salutary developments, he's going to realize, well, we may be exceptional, but it's not in the way you think. We're exceptionally going out of being an empire, and we ought to deal with these folks. So just a kind of a little background here, that Israel has been at the core of all of this. When I said OIL early 2003, I attributed about equal motivation to each one of these oil, Israel, logistics, the permanent military bases. As I watched the things evolve, I became more and more convinced that Israel played the far larger role, probably around 50%, with the other two, 25% each. And that's why when I did that testimony before Congress, what happened? The head of the Democratic National Committee complained that he had to go in and prepare a statement denouncing McGovern and what McGovern said as anti-Semitic. Howard Dean was his name at the time. Little vignette here. The next day, he's in Dallas trying to raise some money, okay? And he meets the deputy head of the Democratic National Party, a good friend of mine. And he says, she says, how about that testimony there? I said, that was awful. You mean yesterday? He said, yeah. That guy, that anti-Semitic guy. And she says, well, that's Ray McGovern, you mean? Yeah, he's a good friend of mine. She says, well, he may be a good friend of yours, but he made a terrible mess about things. I had to go in. I had to interrupt my dinner. The people, really important, like big donors, not little fry like here in Dallas, big donors were calling me and said, look, you better prepare a statement denouncing what McGovern said. So that's how it goes down. But now the situation, I hope, I have enough faith in American character that Americans will come forward and say, look, we're going to demonstrate, we're going to make sure you know, Mr. Trump, that we don't tolerate genocide. And I'm old enough to have lived through one genocide against Jews in Europe, and neither politicians nor church leaders did a damn thing about it until too late. I don't want that to happen again. So pardon my getting up on my pulpit again, but the Israeli lobby is so damn powerful that we have to face into it. And if Trump doesn't do it now, or he has the opportunity, I don't know when it will be done. End of the little sermon.
John, what I was arguing, it wasn't that Donald Trump is not willing to help Netanyahu, but the reality is somehow different from what Netanyahu wants. We know how, I don't know if you had the opportunity to see the report on New York Times in which they mentioned Houthis, the air defenses of Houthis were capable of shooting F-16 and F-35. This is a huge deal on the part of the Trump.
Yes.
They have to face this reality. I'm not talking about the friction between Donald Trump and Netanyahu, but the reality is hitting Donald Trump.
Yes, and you're making the fundamental point, Nima, and thank you for doing it. Basically, it's counter-force capability. Force capability deters U.S. action, Israeli action. They're not going to attack unless they think they've got overwhelming force superiority. The Iranians have showed the capability to defeat Saddam or push him back in a very dangerous and punishing war for both sides. Saddam made a fundamental mistake there for domestic reasons. He refused to take the advice of Moscow not to do that, but he did. The Arab mistakes have cost the Arab states their sovereignty. But you're right, the capability of Iran and the Houthis to demonstrate a level of loss or risk of loss is what's deterring, not some, pardon me, ideological conversion on the part of the President of the United States or his advisors. They want to get on with the wars they think they can win more easily. They want to get on with the wars or the trade wars or the, let's say, political arrangements in the world that benefit the United States. This is what Trump says. This is what he's delivering to his constituencies. And as we've said before, he's placing one war at a time to maximize his capability to win it. And the priority is China. The second is Europe. The third is the Middle East. In Europe, he has the fallback position that if tomorrow there's no deal, he walks away, but he doesn't walk away. He rearms Germany and he rearms France. And over the last few hours, Macron has proposed to move French nuclear weapons forward to Poland and Germany. And that is a very significant strategic change, but in line with the Trump policy, one war at a time. We'll let the Europeans fight. They will pay us to fight Russia. And the strategy of dividing Russia continues. Iran is a very significant Russian strategic interest because it's a potential platform for attacking Russia from the south. There's no pullback of Trumpian policy to break Armenia away from Russia or Azerbaijan away from Russia, to create out of the Caspian Sea a sea that threatens Russia. The strategy remains the same. The ideology might be expressed differently, but in this structure, Iran is still a strategic ally of the United States because Iranian sovereignty to be defended against Netanyahu or whoever, whatever Israeli, don't be fooled. Israeli politicians come and go, and this one will go, but another will come, and their fundamental ideology remains the same. The Russian position here is that Iran has the last chance to defend Russian strategic interests, and there's a treaty on that. And the level of loss a Russian-assisted Iran can threaten is deterring. And Iran's doing the same for the Houthis in Yemen. But that's all that's left. Russia withdrew from Syria. That would have been a forward buffer in the south. But it's lost. It now becomes a threat both northward and eastward and southward. So we are agreeing that there's a strategic support for Iran from Russia, and that is fundamental. However, it's tempered by President Putin's support for Israel. And we haven't talked about that, and there's no time. But China has demonstrably, in this last India-Pakistan conflict, demonstrably shown it cannot do militarily the deterrent job that the Russians can. I know that the Western press has gone on and on about the great success of Chinese air-to-air missiles against the Indian Air Force. This is to have achieved a victory with a mouse when the mountain went to India. Why? Why is this important? Because China's anti-aircraft defenses failed to protect Pakistan's command and control. India's capacity to guard its own nuclear weapons. Sorry, Pakistan's capacity. Pakistan failed to penetrate India's Russian-supplied air defenses. Pakistan failed to protect itself from the BrahMos, the Indian-Russian missile that caused the sudden, and this was the sequence, the sudden move of nuclear weapons on the Pakistan side, which in turn triggered a comparable move of nuclear weapons on the Indian side. And that's what triggered the telephone call from Pakistan to Vance, begging for mediation before the sides escalated, because India showed in that conflict, they lost 5 to 6 aircraft to a Chinese air-to-air missile. We have not been told how many aircraft the Pakistanis lost. We do know how much the losses were on the ground, and that is a strategic warning that China isn't capable of defending Iran, but Russia is. And second, Russia has a strategic interest, its own territorial and sovereign interest in doing that. So where are we? China has to prove it's got force capability in the Middle East. It has done nothing of the sort. Yes, it exercises with Iran and Russia. Yes, it makes port calls. Yes, it has a position in Djibouti. But China has no longer the force capability to deter Israel or the United States in that war. For the time being, Trump is content to focus on his war with China. Second, to let Germany, France, and Poland rearm against Russia for the war to come. He's not against that. He's not against taking the war up to the Arctic. He's also not in favor of a losing war number 3. So he can put Iran on the back burner, achieve a reversion to JCPOA, because the Iranians will give that to him because they've already agreed to it. He walked away from it. If he says they're intelligent, he's basically endorsing JCPOA back again. Fine. It will be in everybody's benefit if war number 3 doesn't go at the speed Netanyahu wants. But is there really a determination on the US side, lobby after lobby, military after military, strategy paper after strategy paper? Is there a real determination to allow Russia to become what it's becoming, with alliances to protect itself on the east with North Korea, in the southeast with China, and in the south with Iran? Is there any real relaxation? Does peace break out? I don't believe so. Peace doesn't break out. Peace is achieved by the capability of force. And right now, Iran has it.
Nima, may I
Go ahead,
just
Ray. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think, John, you do right in focusing on force and military strength. I would suggest that if we look at the last decade or two, you and I have this favorite expression from the Soviet days, the correlation of strategic forces, okay? It's shifted, okay? And nowhere more apparent is this than what has to do with the recent events here. Let's take the Ukraine situation. In July 2023, the geniuses in the CIA told William Burns to tell the president that Putin had already lost militarily in Ukraine, and more important, that the ineffectiveness of his military machine has been exposed for the whole world to see. 8 months before that, his nominal boss, the director of national intelligence, Avril Haines, said, not only that, but the Russians are losing so much equipment on the on the battlefield. They have no indigenous capability to replenish all those weapons that they're okay. Now, why do I say all that? Well, because it's not the Russian military machine that has been exposed to the whole world as being incompetent and, in a real sense, a loser. It is the American military machine. What got into these generals' heads that thought they could challenge Russia in Ukraine? Completely imbeciles is what they are. And the proof is in the pudding. Not only has Putin not lost, Putin can go and move all those Ukrainians from that line of contact now, 800 kilometers high, gradually attriting. He can do that at will because they're falling apart. What does this mean? It just means that as the Chinese and the Iranians and the Russians look at all this, they say, these Americans are delusional if they think they still have a military machine. They don't have any army to speak of. They have a little bit more than the British, but that's, that's a bad comparison. So what I'm saying here is that the U.S. is on the downside, put on the back foot, if you will, and the whole rest of the world realizes that. If somebody smart enough as not Avril Haines, but Tulsi Gabbard comes in and says, look, Mr. President, this is the way it really is. You could fire me for saying this, but this is the way it really is. And this is the way you got to shape the policy. You got to cut a deal with the Russians on Ukraine now so that they'll be willing to put a little lipstick on the pig that will come out because they have won, okay? And then you can turn your attention to other areas. But this is what's got to be done now. So the correlation of forces, that's the word I was looking for, John, has shifted in really big ways, nowhere more clear than in Ukraine, where the US and the allies in NATO tried to take on Russia and were summarily defeated, even though they employed some of their most sophisticated weaponry. And these Russian, quote, barbarians had even more sophisticated weaponry to use, even without using nuclear weapons. I'm referring to the Oreshnik, of course. So the world has changed in incredible ways. We're catching up. I really enjoy catching up together with you, John, and you, Nima. Those are my 2 cents worth right now.
Thank you so much, Ray and John. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you, Nima. Thanks, Ray.
Take care.
Thank you both.